From KUNC and the NPR network, this is In The NoCo. I'm Brad Turner, in today for Erin O'Toole. It's a precarious moment for public media. You've probably heard about it. The Trump administration has declared it wants to end federal funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which supports stations that carry programs from NPR and PBS. If you're wondering where all of this leaves a local station like KUNC or the Colorado Sound, well, we're actually trying to figure that out too. So today we're sharing what we know so far. Mike Arnold is Chief Audience and Content Officer for KUNC and the Colorado Sound. Last week, he was one of about 190 leaders from NPR member stations around the country who met in Washington, D.C. They talked about this moment of uncertainty for public radio and asked lawmakers to continue supporting public media. And Mike joins us now. Mike, thanks for speaking with me.
Thanks for your interest.
And just to get this out of the way, Mike, you oversee all content produced by KUNC News and the Colorado Sound, but you have not seen these questions I'm about to ask, and you'll have no hand in editing this conversation.
Yes, that is true.
Mike, you've worked in public media for more than 3 decades. Why do you think public broadcasting is important at a time when all kinds of news and educational content is accessible on many platforms?
Well, I think public media stations provide a public service, and it's not a commercial product. I think the federal funding helps assure that everyone, regardless of income or location, has access to trusted news. And I think public media has provided that trusted source for a long time. Federal funding really helps make sure that everybody, regardless of whether you have the money or wherever you're located, has access to news, educational programming, and cultural content. I think that's really important because it's becoming much more difficult to get content without having to pay for it. And that's one of the things that's great about public media is we don't have a paywall. And the funding that we get from the federal government is pretty small. It's about $1.60 per American per year, but it has a pretty outsized impact. It helps us be independent. It makes us accountable to the public to some extent. And it allows us to be focused on serving the communities, not just with news and information and cultural programming, but also with important emergency information. So at a time when there's misinformation and a lot of media consolidation, federal funding helps us keep locally focused nonprofit news and cultural programming happening in communities across the country.
Last week, you attended a meeting in Washington with leadership from about 190 NPR member stations. What did you discuss in terms of threats to funding, and what was the mood like?
The mood was actually pretty good, and part of it was because we were able to come together and talk about different ways we're trying to handle this situation. I think there were some that were there from smaller stations that were very concerned. There was a representative from Alaska who attended the meeting, who was very concerned about the future of many stations in that state. I'm originally from Indiana, and I was able to talk to some of my colleagues there. And then they recently had a cut to their state funding, which is fairly significant for that state. And there are some stations there that if they lost federal funding, they'd probably have to go out of business.
Cuts to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting are a major threat to local stations because some of them get as much as half of their funding from federal dollars. KUNC's operating budget is about $6 million a year. What percentage of that budget comes from the CPB right now? And how do you think we'll replace that or make cuts if the CPB money goes away?
It's about 6 or 7% for us, which is still a lot of money, but it's not going to take us off the air necessarily. And that does not include things like some additional support that CPB provides so that stations can present different national programming and also music licensing. So there would be, beyond that 6 or 7%, it probably would push it up to more like 10 to 15% if you were to add those things in. So we would have to make difficult decisions. One of the things we're lucky to see is that we've seen an outpouring of support from the community. And this is something that's always been the case with KUNC and the Colorado Sound, is that we have really good support from our listeners. And that's a helpful thing. We're grateful for that. We're also, we work with members of the business community as well. So one of our strategies for dealing with a situation of the CPB funding were to go away is that we would really work hard to try to get some more support from the community to help us make it through the time and figure out where we go from there.
Mike, it must be tempting for public media leaders to say, this battle for federal funding is a hassle. Let's find another way to pay for our programming. What's your take on that?
I think there's a value to having publicly funded media that can provide education, information, without having to think about, just making a lot of money. We're able to provide mission-driven content because of that support from the federal government. And we're also responsible to provide a balanced service because of that funding as well. So I think it kind of holds us accountable in a lot of ways to be sure that we're providing a service to the community and serving community needs.
The president and his supporters criticize news reporting from NPR and PBS as liberal propaganda. When someone occasionally makes a complaint about KUNC's coverage, you're often the person who takes that phone call. What do you say to those types of critiques when you're on the phone?
Well, the first thing that we do, and a lot of different people from the station will take calls from the public. But I think the first thing we have to do is listen. There are times when people will say, oh, that fact isn't right, or you didn't present that properly. And in many cases, we'll go back and investigate that. If we made an error, we will correct it, and we'll air a correction on the air. With the national programming, NPR has a public editor that takes comments from the public and is regularly writing about that. There have been times where we've brought comments from listeners here to NPR and said, hey, this is how people are hearing this. And I think it's been helpful to NPR. They've really been very responsive to that. So we have a lot of means of addressing those issues.
Mike, if someone hears this interview and wants to do something or make their voice heard on this issue, what do you recommend they do?
I think it depends on what you're thinking. I mean, I think if you're somebody who thinks the government shouldn't be funding public broadcasting and you enjoy listening to what we do, you should support us. And I think that's a really good thing for you to do. If you're somebody who does believe the federal government should be funding public broadcasting, and there are many people who do, we've heard from a lot of people who are both Republicans and Democrats who said, what do we do? Well, one of the things people can do is reach out to their member of Congress or their senator and let them know that they support, public media and they want public media funding to continue. But protectmypublicmedia.org, which is a website that allows you to connect with your member of Congress, has a lot of good ideas on how to do that. So if you go to protectmypublicmedia.org, you can sign up there and get more information about how to communicate with lawmakers about this.
Mike Arnold is Chief Audience and Content Officer for KUNC and the Colorado Sound. And again, he had no input on the editing of this interview. There's one more detail that I wanted to touch on before we go. You may have followed coverage of the Colorado legislature this spring on KUNC, Rocky Mountain PBS, CPR, and the Colorado Sun. That project, called the Colorado Capital News Alliance, is also funded by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And right now, we're not sure what the future looks like for state capital coverage if that CPB funding goes away. So we'll keep you posted. We'll have links to more information related to today's interview in our show notes and at KUNC.org. That's it today for In The NoCo. I'm Brad Turner. Thanks for listening.